Hello everybody, welcome back to Viking.TV. My name is Damon Stanwell-Smith and I am the Head of Science and Sustainability for Viking Expeditions. For today, we're actually discussing a Viking ocean voyage. We are going to be talking about our Bermuda escape itinerary, and this is going to be the opening episode for Bermuda Week on Viking.TV. So I have now the honour and the privilege to be interviewing the President and CEO of the Bermuda Institute for Ocean Science, Bill Curry. So welcome, Bill. And Bill is a veteran of the world-famous Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. However, he's had a long career in marine sciences. So to start with, I would like to ask Bill a little bit about your background, how you got into marine things, and how you've ended up as the president of BIOS.
Well, thank you, Damon, for inviting me to join you for this, and welcome to Vikings cruisers to Bermuda. As Damon said, I've been in the ocean sciences for a fairly long time. I studied in university as a geologist and went off to graduate school and ended up studying marine geology, and found I was very, very interested in the marine sciences, and ended up getting a postdoctoral scholarship to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and stayed there from 1980 to 2012 when I took this position to be the leader of BIOS. I've always been interested in the oceans. My high school yearbook even has a quote about being an oceanographer in it, which somebody pointed out to me at one point to remind me of this long-term interest. But I can say it's been 40 years and it's been wonderful.
Fantastic. And I imagine it's a little bit of a change, as we were just discussing before we started broadcasting, between being in Falmouth, Massachusetts, and being in Bermuda. And how's it like running BIOS?
Well, BIOS is a really challenging organization. It's very small. It lives hand to mouth from mostly grants from the United States government for funding of scientific research. We're generally very successful. The last year and a half has been very challenging because of COVID-19 pandemic, as it has been in many, many places, but we seem to be coming out of that quite well. New interns are arriving daily, and we've got courses lined up to begin at the end of this month on coral reef ecology, and then a well-developed fall semester program for a couple of U.S. universities where students will be coming in to do their marine biology curriculum and some research. So it's all going reasonably well. Thank you.
I'm delighted to hear that, and I'm aware that marine institutions around the world during the pandemic have been so challenged in terms of student complements and being able to do field work and be able to run ships and so on. But I understand that BIOS has a very interesting history and origins, and quite unusual origins. I wonder if you'd share with our guests and viewers a bit about the origins.
Sure. So the origin of what ultimately became BIOS is that in 1903, I believe at the invitation of the Bermuda Zoological Society, scientists from Harvard and New York University came for a summer field season to study organisms in the marine environment and near coastal environment on Bermuda. And they did this annually for quite a few years. There was interest at the time in trying to test the model of Darwin's evolutionary theory, and this was happening in many places around the world, and Bermuda was one of them. As this continued on, there were some interesting things happening in the world of oceans. Not least of them is the fact that World War I saw the introduction of submarines, which made the properties of the ocean beneath the surface of great interest to many governments. And as a result of this, in part, plus the interest in studying the biology here, the U.S. established a marine station on Bermuda with the consent of the Bermuda Parliament, which in around 1926, 1927 passed laws to allow for this establishment to begin. And that's the actual beginning of what became known as the Bermuda Biological Station and the Bermuda Biological Station for Research. And we have been in the eastern end of Bermuda for most of that time, and at our current campus in St. George's since about 1930. The U.S. was interested in this location, not necessarily because of the island, but because true deep ocean conditions are located within about 2 miles of the coastline. So it's easy to study ocean processes from Bermuda, much easier than it is from, say, the east coast of the United States. So.
Well, I mean, as you're so wonderfully located for oceanographic research, aren't you? And I wonder, James, if you might be able to show that. I know there's a bit of video. It is actually an idyllic view. I mean, gosh, the view of the institute and of your research vessel. James, if you're able to pull those up, just to show this is this little. I guess this is home for Bill, but for the rest of us, this looks absolutely glorious.
Yeah. So the campus is right there. You see the largest building there. That is the original building of this campus. That's our ship, the Atlantic Explorer, which you'll learn a little bit more about later in the interview. We're located in St. George's on about 15 acres of property. It's waterfront on what's called Ferry Reach, and it has very quick access to the ocean. It's a really excellent location, well set up for all the logistics necessary to go to sea.
Yeah, well, that's glorious. And since the origins, as you said, about 90 years ago, I understand that you've also done some extraordinary science in terms of the long-term monitoring, oceanographic monitoring. I wonder if you could tell us about this oceanographic monitoring, please.
So a very well-known physical oceanographer from Woods Hole Oceanographic, a fellow named Henry Stommel, in the early 50s suggested that we really didn't know much about how the ocean changed with time, and set up a sampling program just southeast of Bermuda, in which a small boat from Bermuda would go about 20 kilometers offshore into the deep ocean and do full water column measurements of temperature and salinity and dissolved oxygen and whatever other measurements were capable at the time, and repeat that every 2 weeks to the extent possible. That started in 1954, and although there are some 6-week or 8-week gaps in it when our ship is in the shipyard or for various reasons, basically we have continuous records going on at that location since 1954, normally every 2 weeks. And the type of records that clearly show that the surface oceans have been warming, not necessarily continuously, but up and down, but an overall secular trend toward warmer temperatures in the surface. Because there's warmer temperatures, that means there's greater evaporation of the water out of the ocean, which means that the salinity of the ocean has been getting higher continuously since 1954. We've also been measuring the water at great depths. So the water that you find at Bermuda at about 3,000 meters water depth, it's in the North Atlantic up close to Labrador and Greenland. And you can see changes in that water as it's changed with time as well over the last 60, 70 years. And then the deepest waters that reach here actually 50 years before originated in the Antarctic region, and we get to monitor. We've been monitoring those as well. It's a really invaluable record of the long-term changes. It's probably the longest record of such things on the planet right now, and it's one of the things we're most well known for.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah.
Let me elaborate a little bit more. In the 1980s, when atmospheric CO2 increases started to become of concern to scientists and governments, we established as well measurements of the biology, biogeochemistry, and chemistry that have been going on continuously since then as well. And those show similar sorts of long-term changes like rising CO2 in the water, changing pH, things like that. So really valuable data sets.
Oh, I mean, it's invaluable, isn't it? And in fact, when you reflect on doing simple, systematic recording over these longer time periods and how often the data sets get stopped from lack of funding or from changing research priorities. But when I hear you're describing having fortnightly for 70 plus years is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. That's so useful. And I understand, in fact, there was a few black and white images came up when you were describing BIOS as the institute, and I saw a bathysphere pop up. I think there was an image of a bathysphere going over the side of the boat of Charles William Beebe and his extraordinary deep diving. I understand that the institute was in the spotlight then as well.
Yep. That was in the early 1930s, and Beebe and Barton did their dives southeast of Bermuda as well. They did a lot of their planning on, I believe some of it was done on Nonsuch Island at the time, but also on the BIOS campus. There are buildings with plaques that recognize Beebe's plans for certain expeditions that were put together in buildings on our campus. What's interesting about that is that they were able to get deeper than anyone else had ever gone, down about 3,000 feet, more than half a mile into the water. It was the first time that humans had been able to make observations well below the light penetration zones in the ocean, and you get to see a whole bunch of different types of organisms down there, organisms that are not necessarily needing photosynthetic activities to survive. That's a good example on the screen right now. That's one of I think that's called a viper fish, if I'm not mistaken. And that is one of the discoveries that Beebe made. One of the things that's really interesting, if you ever have a chance to check it out, is this was before underwater photography was much of a process going on, maybe not at all. And everything was hand drawn, and some of the most exquisite artwork you'll ever see are the anatomical drawings of some of these discoveries. It's really fabulous stuff. That's
wonderful, isn't it? And to a marine scientist, Beebe is a legend, but I guess outside he's maybe less well known than some. And of course, with your background at Woods Hole, which is also famous for deep diving with the submersible Alvin. And for Viking.TV viewers, if you have an interest in going deep down, as Bill is describing, into the sea, there are interviews with Kathy Sullivan from last June, and also with Jim Delgado, the marine archaeologist, was interviewed in April a few months ago. And in fact, next week we have an interview with Don Walsh as well, who was talking of deep diving, also was one of the pioneers going deep down into the Challenger Deep, Marianas Trench. So as Bill will be aware that with Viking Expeditions side as well, with the 4 submersibles, and we're planning of a big submersible operation that we're running with our expedition ships, I think there's a lot of excitement around the sort of the deep sea side, and it's wonderful that so much pioneering work was done at BIOS whenever that was, 90 years ago now, gosh.
Yeah, and Beebe clearly was a major step along that path that resulted in a deep dive into the Challenger Deep. So it's remarkable stuff.
It's so pioneering. It's like going to the moon, isn't it? Well, from describing the institution, if we were to reflect on what the different research themes that you're undertaking, I wondered if, we discussed briefly about the long-term observations. So what do you find are the top findings? What are the trends that you're seeing?
Yeah. So as I did say before, worth reiterating, there's clear evidence that the oceans are warming because the atmosphere is warming from rising CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. We have a station on island that measures atmospheric CO2 concentrations for the what's called the NOAA Global CO2 Monitoring Programs, and it shows that the well-mixed atmosphere is just continually going up, several ppm each year. Bermuda is no different. You see the same type of increase in the surface oceans because the ocean is one of the main sinks for atmospheric CO2. So when the atmosphere increases in CO2, part of it goes into the ocean, and we're monitoring those changes, and you see rising CO2. And because of a chemical reaction that happens in seawater with CO2, there's a reduction in the pH, meaning that the ocean is becoming slightly more acidic with time because the CO2 is reacting and producing carbonic acid. It's a weak acid, but it's still an acid, and it's changing the chemistry in ways that could affect the biology in the oceans. There's no doubt that the oceans are rising in temperature, and that's causing the salinity to increase. Salinity and temperature control the density of water, and that can affect how the water circulates. Also, the ocean surface is getting warmer, but the deeper parts are not getting warm very quickly, which is changing the density stratification of the surface waters and reducing the mixing from below of the colder nutrient-rich waters. And these waters are the fertilizers that allow the phytoplankton to photosynthesize and the biological production to go during the seasonal production times. And if we come up to a point where the density gradients are such that the mixing is significantly reduced, that'll reduce the amount of productivity in the surface oceans. And the downstream effect of that would be even in food availability at places, because everything in the food chain relies on that starting process. So these are all really, really important types of things to study. The results are of fundamental value to people who are the stakeholders, basically, who have to make the regulatory decisions about what we do about fishing and what we do about, CO2 production, fossil fuel burning, all sorts of different things. So I think the data are incredibly valuable. It's interesting to be a part of that kind of a larger process and have our work be of such value to the larger community.
Oh, absolutely. And as you say, the primary productivity driven by, I guess, the phytoplankton and also maybe some of the weed and so on that is growing, thinking about where Bermuda is located. I understand that you also have a big research theme into plankton and productivity.
Yep.
How does that continue?
So we're very interested in how microorganisms and also smaller bacteria and viruses and other very small organisms in the ocean affect the carbon cycle. So there are microorganisms that change their depth from very deep during the day when the upper parts of the ocean are sunlit for protection to very shallow at night when they eat in the dark with safety because they're not easily preyed upon by other organisms. And these organisms are basically eating material in the surface waters and then going down 100, 200 meters and basically pooping and peeing and taking nutrients and taking carbon and from the surface and excreting it at great depth. And this is a process that plays a role in removing carbon from the surface waters, and that removal process impacts things like what the CO2 is in the surface waters and how much it uptakes from the atmosphere. So it does affect the carbon sink and has a larger role beyond just the organisms themselves living and reproducing and dying, Now, the chemical part of it is that these organisms can be very sensitive to pH of the water that they're living in. So that's another major part of the type of work we do. And some of that work is done in the ocean itself, and some of it is done in laboratories on our campus where we do perturbation studies in mesocosm facilities where we control for changes in pH and see what it does to a variety of organisms. Among them are the plankton, but also corals and other organisms that we can culture on campus.
Well, and you mentioned coral reefs. I understand there's a third research theme with ocean acidification and the challenges of carbonate fixing or say calcium carbonate fixing and so on, aragonite. My understanding is that the Bermuda coral reefs are relatively resilient, but are still, as you say, it's a changing maritime environment.
Yeah. Overall, the Bermuda coral reef structures and the coral reefs are relatively healthy compared to many reef systems around the world who have suffered from degradation due to human impacts. Bermuda, the water on the reef top has a very short residence time, and it's flushed with very clean open ocean water quite regularly because of tidal processes and wind-driven circulation, and so the quality of the water is quite good. Bermuda is also very far from the equator for a coral reef island compared to most, which means that the island surface waters have one of the largest annual cycles of temperature. So summertime temperatures, 28 degrees C, 29 degrees C. Wintertime temperatures, 19 degrees C, 20 degrees C. That's about a 10 degrees C range of temperature, whereas many tropical islands, the range is more like 4, 5, 6 degrees C. We think, and we're trying to study to better understand this, we think that the large annual cycle has, through evolution, allowed for the organisms on the Bermuda's reef to become more resilient to temperature extremes, because on an annual cycle, they see a set of temperature extremes from very warm to very cold. And that's one of the major types of studies that we do, is how is the resilience of our corals? Well, is it genetic? Is it transferable? Could you take corals from Bermuda and place them elsewhere, and would they be successfully able to withstand the temperature changes elsewhere? Similar types of studies are going on to see what changing pH in the ocean might do. Corals have a basic skeleton that's made out of calcium carbonate, the aragonite version of it, and that is very susceptible to changes in pH. And so another one of the major resilience studies is how resilient are these corals to changes in ocean acidification, pH of the ocean waters. That's another part of what we do. And the coral reefs also provide one of the other things that makes BIOS attractive, is that it is a draw for our students. Many students want to come here to take our courses because part of the courses involves in the water laboratory work on coral reefs. Everybody who wants to be a marine biologist also wants to study corals, at least to start. So that's a major draw for the organization in terms of our education activities.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I can see that we've got some short films showing your wet labs and the work that's going on.
Yep, that was one of the inside in laboratory mesocosms. We have both interior, artificially lit mesocosm systems and external natural light mesocosm systems active basically through a large portion of the reproductive time of coral reefs. Corals tend to reproduce on Bermuda early summer into fall.
Yeah, and as you say, every young marine scientist, at least part of the drive, if they're not keen on dolphins and whales, then one of the other main drivers in my experience has been coral reef studies. And as you say, you're so strategically placed, and the research you're describing is so fundamental to the understanding of the marine sphere. It's extraordinary. So you mentioned that you are just a few miles from the deep ocean, and we had a teaser a few minutes ago with the little pan round of the front of the institute and that large vessel sitting at the front. And in my experience, running research vessels is always it's fun, but also hard work. So I understand you have a substantial research vessel. Tell us about the RV Atlantic Explorer.
I will. So RV Atlantic Explorer is a vessel that is part of what's called the UNOLS fleet. UNOLS stands for University National Oceanographic Laboratory System. It's a U.S. System for operating research vessels. There's about 20 different vessels that are part of the fleet. They're all operated by some non-governmental institution, usually a university or a research institution like BIOS, like Woods Hole. Our vessel is about 170 feet long. It is classified as an ocean class, meaning that it has the capability of operating basically throughout the North Atlantic region. It can stay at sea 30-some plus days, given its fuel, its capabilities for distance. It easily gets up from Bermuda to Greenland and Labrador if it needs to. It's done that once since I've been director. Every year it goes from Bermuda to Puerto Rico on a line. Sometimes it goes over to the East Coast or the Gulf of Mexico, but mostly it stays near Bermuda, and every 2 weeks it goes out and makes those measurements on our time series. Every month it goes out and makes the other measurements on chemistry. So about 2/3 of its operating time is local, and then about another third of it is done by other people, not BIOS people, but still probably local, or somebody who wants it maybe up near the Labrador Sea or near the East Coast or something like that. It's a U.S. flagged vessel. It means that it has very rigorous inspections and shipyard rules that govern it. And you were right earlier when you said it's quite a chore to keep one of these things going. Originally,
a labor of love, I imagine. And of course, in other Viking TV broadcasts, I have reflected on some aspects of our expedition ships that have similar capacity, although we don't have an A-frame on the back. I can see you have a big substantial A-frame. Ours is more around the submersibles and the wet lab. But when on the Atlantic Explorer, how many scientists might you have working doing your when you're doing your regular sampling, when you're out monthly or whatever?
Let me describe this without including the pandemic restrictions. Normally,
in a world without coronavirus.
Normally the ship carries a marine crew of about 12 or 13 people on the bridge, in the engine room, and on the deck, and it can carry up to 20 scientific passengers. That crew is usually made up of 5 or 6 or 7 team members from our time series teams, plus visitors that come and want to work with them. We also are able to use it for experiences in our classes. So people who come to BIOS to take a class may also have the opportunity to spend a 24, 36-hour trip out on the Atlantic Explorer during one of its cruises to see what exactly it is like to be at sea and to do work remotely like that.
I can imagine. And and when you say with coronavirus, does that just reduce is that going forward going to change, or is it just during the last year and a half you've not been able to run your typical voyages?
So we're coming out of it a little bit now that vaccinations are much more common. Last year, when there were no vaccines, but we were still operating the ship, every person who went on that vessel for a cruise had to be in quarantine for the 14 days prior to that cruise, and to have a series of pre-departure tests. And everybody was required to maintain social distancing and masking while on the vessel, which meant that our cabins were not occupied by more than one person. And that significantly reduced the number of people that we could send out. And also, I believe we had to have mess hall access in shifts to reduce the number of people congregating in the mess hall at any one time. That has just begun to change because right now, nearly every person in our Marine Department has been vaccinated. Nearly every one of our scientists has been vaccinated, and the rules from UNOLS have been changed so that there are different protocols of access now for vaccinated versus unvaccinated people. So we have just started to inch up in the number of people that we'll allow on the ship, just starting now, basically. We got that word on that in the last 2 weeks.
Oh, that's very exciting. And in fact, running Viking vessels, although we don't call our guests going to the mess hall, it's the principle's the same: where you eat, where you sleep, where you work, and how the world's evolved. And we're in exactly that same state of working out how to come back. And it's very timely at the moment with all our ships coming back. Well, I mean, she looks an amazing vessel. And I look at that and are excited at the thought of Viking guests that can come on our expedition ships and experience maybe a little of what you're describing the same way your students can on your research vessel. And then reflecting a bit about what you said about Bermuda. I mean, what an amazing strategic and extraordinarily sort of in terms of biogeography of where you're based. Can you share with the audience a little about the sort of marine life of Bermuda? What's the highlights for you?
Sure. So the highlights for me, Bermuda, are basically the offshore part of it, because that's such a major part of our work, but also the coral reef, the bank top coral reef, the surrounding coastal environment. Very, very interesting. They've got, coral reef fishes. It's pretty amazing diversity of fishes. The island has seagrasses and mangroves. Like many places, some of them have been degraded with time, but the island is doing a very good job of trying to restore, and BIOS and its education programs are involved with several of those types of restoration projects, particularly the mangroves. There are interesting environments on land. Most of the rock outcrops you see are former dunes, so that are actually mostly terrestrial geological features. So you can actually see fossilized palmetto trees and freshwater mollusks in dune deposits, things like that. It's a very, very interesting place to come and spend some time if you're interested in the naturalism of a tropical island. It's very well set up for that.
Oh, sounds glorious. Now, I understand we have a little montage of some videos and music just to give a taster to our viewers of what Bill is so evocatively describing. Well, it's as viewers have seen, that there's some wonderful underwater footage there of different wildlife. Now, I understand there's a very interesting sort of conservation history in Bermuda that you might wish to share.
Sure. So Bermuda passed the earliest legislation for marine conservation in the Western Hemisphere when it restricted the taking of turtles in the 1600s, early 1600s, and that's just a remarkable example of how the country, the people of Bermuda, have respected the surrounding marine environment. And even now, they're working on developing marine protected areas and things like that to ensure the future of their own blue economy going forward. Trying to balance the stakeholder interests of fishing versus recreation, and optimized use of the marine environment without degrading it. It's quite an interesting time to be here and be a part of it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you're 250 years ahead of many other legislation, the conventional wisdom being that maybe in the 19th century, their sort of awareness became more apparent on marine conservation. And we've seen sort of general images about Bermuda marine life. I understand that a highlight for visiting scientists, and indeed visitors generally to Bermuda, are fireworms. And I also, I hear there's a story attached to maybe one of your predecessors, and they're in their role, the same role that you hold now. Please do tell us more.
Yeah. So fireworms, sometimes called glowworms when you're on island, are worms that live in the seabed in shallow waters on the Bermuda platform. And in the warmer months in summertime, they undergo a very interesting reproductive dance. A female will come out of the mud and go up to the surface and release her eggs and other attractive stuff to draw males, and it glows. It's a greenish color and it's very obvious, and it's meant to attract a male, and the male will look like a dart of light that attacks that mass that's circular flowing on the surface. It's really quite extraordinary. But what's really most interesting about it is that it happens for the 2 or 3 days after the full moon, and it always starts at about 56 minutes after sunset. So the interesting story about that is that was all worked out by the children of a former director of BIOS named Wolfgang Sterer, who asked his children to go out and hunt for the glowworms and write down the time when they saw them. And they figured out that it was on these particular days and at this particular time past sunset. And it's now, you can practically set your clock by it, but visitors to the island can also take glowworm cruises, fireworm cruises from a number of different organizations on the island to see them in nature. It's really quite interesting.
That's fantastic. And is it seasonal? Is there a time during the year when one sees them more than others?
Yeah, they're pretty much limited to the summer, June, July, August, maybe September, so it's during the warm season in Bermuda, not the colder months. Yeah.
But so for Viking guests turning up this week and beyond, is there a chance maybe to see in when they're visiting?
They have to take a look at the moon, the lunar cycle, figure out when the full moon is, and check out the advertisements online that you might find from the Bermuda Aquarium or the Bermuda Underwater Exploration Institute.
Absolutely. Yeah. So absolutely, I think being aware of the state of the moon is important for everybody at sea, isn't it? That's wonderful. Yep. And has that raised the bar with your extended family coming to visit? Have you said, well, predecessors discovered this, now they want to find some other new phenomenon?
I haven't told them about it though either. So,
well, it's a lovely story, and it looks like a fantastic phenomenon to experience when people have the chance. And the other side of conservation, that's the wonderful seeing these amazing phenomena is sometimes one has to sort of intervene to manage when things get a little out of hand. I understand there's There's research also undertaken with an invasive fish, the lionfishes that live on coral reefs. I wondered, James, if you could just show a short video of something it's quite shocking in a way, what you have to do.
Yeah. So lionfish reached Bermuda quite a few, maybe 5-10 years ago. They were originally released in the Atlantic near Florida, and they've been spreading ever since. And they're native to the Pacific Ocean. And what that means is that the local fish population don't view them as a natural predator. And they tend to be voracious eaters of juvenile fish. So having them be freely reproducing and growing in numbers on a coral reef platform can be devastating to the overall fish population, the fish ecology. And so lots of organizations on island are working together to try to minimize the impact of lionfish. It involves collecting them, studying them, trying to understand where and when they'll be in certain places, understanding their reproductive habits, and also organizing various types of hunts to be able to collect them and to develop relationships with the island restaurant community to supply this fish as a main course in island restaurants. They really are delicious.
Oh wow, that's a nice tie-in, isn't it? Gosh.
Wonderful tasting.
Invasive that's also good eating is.
Yeah. So there's a lot of that type of activity going on. I think it's perhaps the only legalized spearfishing on island, but I'd have to be double checked on that, whether there's other. But I know that they allow permits for people trained to do it and to follow certain sets of rules, and there are organized hunts and tournaments to collect them and things like that going on. And people that buy it play a role.
Spearfishing, although can be controversial at times in other locations, being so targeted, you can definitely, if you know what you're doing, I suppose, remove the specific aliens. And moving on to, from all the amazing things that Bas is up to, when Viking guests come to Bermuda to come and see you, I understand that on our Bermuda Escape voyages, there is a chance to come and visit, which is amazing. This is Viking Orion, I think, cruising through beautiful islands of Bermuda. And I understand that there are two excursions to different islands, to Cooper's Island and Nonsuch Island. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what our guests could look forward to.
Yep. So let's start with Cooper's Island. Cooper's Island is on the island of St. David's. It's more of a peninsula than an island, and it is land that's being reclaimed and naturalized after the U.S. military used it as a base for many, many years. And what Viking excursions and BIOS are offering is a nature walk and a snorkeling excursion to Cooper's Island as part of the visit. That is, it's a really nice area to go. It's very relaxing, and the snorkeling is pretty good there. The other excursion is a boat excursion to what's called Nonsuch Island. Nonsuch Island has an interesting history. Many years ago, a local scientist, ornithologist named David Wingate found that the Bermuda petrel called the cahao was still reproducing on that island. At the time, it was thought that the Bermuda petrel might have been extinct. And he took it upon himself to help do everything he can to conserve the natural state of Nonsuch Island. And he and the Bermuda government and other non-governmental organizations have done a lot of work to try to reproduce the original indigenous plant and animal populations on that island. There's restricted access to it. We need permits to get on there, but there is an excursion by boat and a tour to be able to see the types of things that are going on. At times of year when the cahao are there, you may be able to see them. And there's also online access to video cameras for seeing what's available in terms of the birds at the time, real-time video for
Sounds
that.
fantastic.
It's a very interesting tour, and it's all about the history of conservation of that island.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned in our conversation prior to this broadcast, that in 2003 I was a guest visiting scientist with the UK Overseas Territories Conservation Forum to Bermuda, and had a visit and on such and met David and saw, and it was very formative actually. I found it very moving to see what an individual, almost being a little bit bloody-minded about what can be done in terms of personal role in conservation for a specific location and set of species. So even as you mention it now, it reminds me of those times 18 years ago. Yeah. Well, I'm super grateful for you taking the time to share with us about clearly an institute that you care about very much and run with extraordinary the different work that's going on with your team. And I want to thank you so much for taking that time to share these insights, and also to thank Viking.TV viewers for taking the time to share with us. But I'll give the last word to you, Bill.
Well, Damon, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here, and let's do it again sometime.
Fantastic. Wonderful. I can't wait to come and visit your institute. And for everybody, those that are watching this and learning what they're going to be seeing, I hope you have a fantastic time. And as we open up for sailing, I hope to see you on board sometime soon. And until next time, thank you.